33-story hotel and condo project.
I'd probably be
okay,
like
that.
that.
Stop. Tap.
This is a plan by the community for the community.
This one here. You're showing me.
No problem, Ken. Thanks for having me.
It's Kent Mulgat for KelownaNow. This is Kent Mulgat. I'm joined by Dan Albas, the MP for Central Okanagan Similkameen, the Conservative MP. Nice to have you.
Thanks, Kent. Really appreciate you opening up KelownaNow and letting me come discuss some of the issues in Parliament.
And you know, we have 10 minutes or so I would like to start with letting our viewers get to know you a little better.
Sure.
So tell us something that people might not know about Dan Albas.
Well, my mom always said I had a face for radio, but no. Anyway. Well, I was a small business owner for 15 years. I taught martial arts, and so I taught kids, youth, and adults how to bring out their best.
Martial arts?
Martial arts, and so whether it had been fitness kickboxing for people who wanted to get into shape, or if they wanted to learn self-defense, or some of the other martial art disciplines like Kung Fu, I facilitated that. And so what I tell people is I used to teach, 4 and 5 year olds to kick me in the shins and feel better about themselves. Now I make sure that anyone who has a beef with the federal government can kick me in the shins and feel better about themselves.
Fantastic. So does having that in you, that knowledge, the body control and the discipline from a sport like that, is that something that kind of, you carry with you that gives you a level of confidence?
Oh, absolutely. And, you look at Olympians like Justin Cripps, who was originally from Summerland. The man carries himself well. He communicates well. He's focused. Martial arts has a lot of the same attributes. And so when you're in the House of Commons, when I stand in my place and speak about what my constituents are talking about and what their concerns are, I always try to keep myself restrained, don't use unparliamentary language, give respect to the other side. Because at the end of the day, whether it be a judo match or a disagreement in Parliament, people expect you to try your best, but they also expect you to play by the rules. And I try to represent my constituents in a way that they would feel proud of. They may not have voted for me, but at least they know that when I raise a concern, it's being done in a way that they could feel at least supportive of.
Great. Now, that aside, your demeanor has to have changed because there you were having to defend a government. And now you're in the opposition, so your whole role has changed. How have you adjusted to being the one complaining about the way things are going instead of defending it?
Well, it's interesting you raise that because I think that this has been a very good thing for me as an individual parliamentarian. When you only see one side of the coin, then you don't really know exactly what you're talking about. For example, Wayne Easter is a longtime Liberal MP. He served in cabinet, but he's also the chair of the Finance Committee. We were discussing the other day how he sat on all 4 sides of the committee table, both as a minister being peppered with questions, as an opposition MP asking those questions, as a Liberal member defending those questions, and now as a chair. And I think what that does in our system, it allows you to understand why we have adversarial politics. It's so that a government, and we give them considerable amount of money, power, and authority, that they have someone to answer to. So I'm a big proponent of our system. People sometimes don't like the us versus them approach, but again, when you have an issue that's important to the public, it's important that the public knows that someone is scrutinizing and asking the questions, and that the government can take those ideas and implement them. Look at a case in the 1990s where we knew that deficits were a huge problem. The New York, one of the major publications in New York had actually questioned Canada's ability to make its payments and said that it was, becoming like a third world country. Paul Martin balanced the budget, but he did so only after you had Preston Manning and his opposition party, the Reformers at that time, that called for it. And whether we talk about free trade, when the Harper government came into office, they took the Chrétien free trade agenda and then increased it. So when there's something that's good for the national interest, a government should listen to those opposition voices and then make changes in its behavior.
As an observer, I would think the opposition might get a little more credit and people might listen to it more if occasionally we heard an opposition party saying, actually, we agree with that policy. Then when you disagree, it would carry more weight. But if it's just disagree, you get tuned out.
Oh, absolutely. And actually, in my Member of Parliament reports, I write one weekly. I give the government credit often. For example, the approval of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. That's something I know that some Liberals are split upon, but again, it was the right thing to do for our country. Because we need to see the equivalent. We're right now, because we don't have access to international markets through a pipeline, we get about a 20% lower, 20 to 30% lower cost of what we receive, a price, I should say, of what we receive for the oil. And so if you're an Albertan, that's the equivalent of a new school every day. Wow. Every 3 days, that's the equivalent of a new hospital. So, other things I agreed with the government on, I do think the Canada Child Benefit was definitely an improvement. We saw when we first introduced the Universal Child Care Benefit, where we gave $100 to everyone who had a child under 6, the Liberals panned it as being, oh, you're just going to give money and parents are going to spend it on beer and popcorn. But what it did is it actually gave parents that ability to figure out how they could best provide for their children. And so I said that in the House of Commons. That was an improvement. And so I think it all depends on the approach. I think Canadians want to see a good thrashing of issues. They also want to see, though, as I said earlier, when a government picks up on a good policy and another government comes in, that they should claim it, work it, expand it, like we have done with free trade, like we have done, at least right. Until recently, with balanced budgets. It used to be where either a Conservative or a Liberal finance minister would work very hard to actually show a budget that was balanced. Now it seems to be that it's a bit of a dirty word in Ottawa, but ultimately I do think that there's a lot of benefits in having balanced budgets, particularly when you have good times.
And we missed it by about $18 billion in this recent Liberal
yes.
budget. Is there a bit of too much spending, would you say?
Yes, I would say that. And again, I will put it in as that the Liberals ran in 2015 on a promise that they would run 2 consecutive deficit budgets, that they would put those $10 billion a year in deficits towards infrastructure, and that they would return back to balance by 2019. And clearly, by the budget that was tabled last week, there was never any inclination that they were going to do that. The spending is, we have deficits for another 25 years as far as what the finance department says. As you said, $18.1 billion in debt this year, and they're actually lowering the amount of money that is being spent on infrastructure by $2.1 billion. So the question is, where's that money going? And also, we also have to look at it. Right now, we're very fortunate that there's good economics. We had a very good year in 2017. But all the private sector economists are saying that there is going to be lower expectations for growth. Our aging demographics are starting to kick in. You have NAFTA uncertainty. You also have low business investment. And again, what that all points to is that we may be getting near the end of our business cycle. And that's where, again, governments, when times are bad, you want them to be able to have a little bit more money, fiscal room to be able to pay for important programs. But again, if we continually spend money that we don't have during the good times, well, when is it ever appropriate to pay it back?
Right.
And again, like we saw with the 90s, it was massive cuts. And I don't think that's anything that anyone wants to see.
No. Now, one issue that, as soon as I think of Dan Albas, I think of the fight that you have tirelessly fought, sometimes probably like banging your head against a wall, about trying to remove the interprovincial trade
yes.
barriers when it comes to the sale of wine. Where are we doing with that?
Okay, so
how are we doing?
Well, first of all, the agreement that was ratified by all provincial and territorial governments with the federal government last year did not include any interprovincial transit of wine, beer, or spirits. Now, it did, though, for cannabis. So, again, they said, we'll punt this, we'll form a working committee, we'll see whether that committee comes up with anything. But, a few weeks ago we had the BC wine ban, where Premier Notley decided to use the BC wine industry as a bargaining chip to force John Horgan to abandon any efforts to stop the Trans Mountain Pipeline. And that issue aside, I actually think it's quite funny, though, that BC wine enthusiasts want to see proper market access for their product, and Albertan people that work in the oil sands want to see market access as well. So it's interesting how it's government that seems to be blocking these things. But getting back to the very point, Alberta is a major market, and to have a government, basically step on the BC wine that has nothing to do with the pipeline was disappointing at very best. But it just goes back to the point where we need to have true free trade in this country. Now, I proposed a motion in March of 2016 that the government should support what's called the Como case and elevate that to the Supreme Court. Now, the Liberal Party voted against the Conservatives, NDP, and Greens, and even the Bloc, and said that they didn't feel that was a good idea. Well, the New Brunswick Liberal Party that's in power actually then referred it to the Supreme Court. So in December, we actually heard arguments on the Como case, and Gerard Como was a man who actually was ticketed by the RCMP for bringing beer and spirits back into New Brunswick from Quebec because he was able to buy it at a lower cost. And so he didn't think it was right that he was given this fine, and he took it to court, and he won his court case. And so now this court case is, has had its hearing at the Supreme Court. I'm anxious, I'm hopeful that the Supreme Court will come out and say that free trade of Canadian products is in the Constitution. We're one national economy. Right. We're a political union, and we should also be an economic one. And that if someone makes a fine bottle of wine in British Columbia, they should be able to send it to people in Ontario. Right now, vintners in Ontario can send to BC, no restrictions.
But BC can't send to Ontario.
Exactly.
Well, legally.
Well, no, and that's the question. Is because really this is under federal jurisdiction, and so my hopes is that if the Supreme Court comes out with a ruling that says, you know what, free trade is free trade. If it's as long as it's a Canadian product, you are assured that it can trade across, despite the protectionism of certain provinces. Then all provinces and territories and the federal government will have to abide by it. And so I'm very hopeful. That being said, this is Canada, and if the Supreme Court was just consisting of my opinion, right, people might be worried.
Change comes slowly, it seems. So, but there is a huge change coming in this country. That it's amazing. At a recent Chamber of Commerce meeting in Kelowna, you see all of these conservative business people talking about all of the opportunities that legalized cannabis might provide. It was amazing to see. 10 years ago, I never would have believed that this would be the world we're living in. How do you feel about this change? Is it good for Canada?
Well, let's put this into context. This is one of the only promises that the federal Liberals are actually keeping from their 2015 election. So I'm a big believer that A, they did win a mandate, but B, I also find it surprising that this is the one promise that they're going to keep come hell or high water. If you look at it, provinces were very concerned because obviously they're responsible for workplace safety. Police authorities were concerned because whether or not they had the proper training as well as the proper equipment to be able to charge someone for driving under the influence. Again, that's something that I think has been rushed, and I don't think we fully know. We still don't know what the Americans are going to do when Canadians decide that they're going to cross the border. Will they let people in, or will there be, this can be another trade irritant? We've had a number of trade irritants with the
right.
Americans of late, steel and aluminum tariffs, for example.
Right.
And so there's a lot of unanswered questions. And I think that that's where the government needs to do a better job, is in describing. Right now what it's done is it's thrown a lot to the provinces, and maybe that will be okay. But when it comes to the big things, the safety of our roads, of our workplaces, there's a lot of unanswered questions.
So with how many questions they've answered so far, would you say at this point you oppose it?
Well, I voted against it in the House of Commons.
Today, you would vote that again today?
Oh, no, absolutely. And the reason is that I've said very clearly that they have a mandate to do this. But again, the way that they're going about and doing it, and basically legalizing without answering the questions on how we're going to handle the workplace safety, how we're going to handle the driving under influence, to make sure that, for example, that wherever you go across the country, that there's a uniform process. Because again, if someone gets charged and they take it to court and there isn't a standardized, acceptable way of identifying when someone is under the influence and when they aren't, marijuana will stay in someone's system for weeks at a time.
Right.
And again, these are questions that we just can't answer. We can simply point out to science right now, conclusively, 0.08% blood alcohol level means you're impaired. Right. And we just don't have those same metrics. So again, I congratulate the government on trying to keep a promise. But again, it's also how they do things, and I think that my job as opposition is to point these things out, because at the end of the day, it's going to be my constituents on those roads, It's going to be employers in our area. I get calls all the time from people that are concerned about whether or not that people will be allowed to grow in their rentals properties. So there's a lot of unanswered questions, and I do think that we need to have a better read on this.
Well, it's good you've got your eyes on it. We appreciate you coming in today.
Great.
Dan Albas, the MP for Central Okanagan, Similkameen. It's been great having you.
Thanks so much for having me, Ken.
This is
Appreciate
Ken
it.
Mulgat for Kelowna Now.